Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host Jacob Shorba, and today we'll be discussing 10 more prospects that could fit the Jacksonville Jaguars in the 2023 NFL Draft. This is our second video on the topic, so if you haven't watched the previous one, then I highly recommend you check that one out as well. Talked about some other players. For example, one of those guys was Darnell Washington. We talked about Brian Branch, Osiris Torrance, some of these other big names you could see in the early rounds, while also hitting on some players that we could see on day 2 for the team, late day 2, and maybe even early day 3. So if you haven't watched that, highly recommend you go check that out as well, because there's going to be some names that don't make it on this video because we've either talked about them before, or they're going to be players that we hopefully get to talk about in the future. So with that said, we got 10 prospects that we're going to go over today. We have quite a few on the defensive side of the ball, specifically at cornerback. So there will be a lot of talking about that part of the team. But we're not going to start out there. We're actually going to start out with Wanya Morris for this. So Wanya Morris, the first thing you have to know about him is that what is going to make teams attracted to him is the physical upside with him. He's got pretty much every size requirement that an NFL team is going to want to see for a player to come in. So you've got that right off the bat. Another thing that's really important with him is that he has the versatility to really play about anywhere on the offensive line. Not sure about center as much, but he can kick into guard. So you've got a prospect that right off the bat, he meets all these physical needs. He can play anywhere. He offers a lot in those regards. But there's also some downside with him, and this is where he turns into more of one of the ultimate, I don't want to say boomer bust, but developmental picks in the second or third day of the draft that could turn out really well for a franchise. So Wanya Morris, the big issue with him that you're going to hear a lot about is going to be his technique, his knowledge of the game, and most importantly, his consistency as a player. He was very erratic, hit or miss. You don't really know what you're getting with him a lot of the time. However, the good sign for Wanya Morris is that he had a really good showing at the Senior Bowl. I think he silenced some of those concerns. Not necessarily that they're just going to go away magically, but I think he did a lot for his draft stock. And I think you could feel a little more comfortable picking him up, knowing that this is a guy you're probably not starting right off the bat unless you absolutely have to, but someone that you can develop. And so I think he's a fantastic selection if you're looking for a guy at swing tackle, say at the end of the second day of the draft or with one of your fourth rounders on day 3. I think that would make a lot of sense, and especially under Phil Rauscher, who's been really successful as an offensive line coach in Jacksonville. Definitely one of the better coaches on the staff, of which there are many good coaches. So, you like the pairing. You like what you're getting. I think as far as whether he gets drafted to the team, probably comes down to whether or not Jawaan Taylor is sticking here. Because if Taylor sticks around, I'm not sure they're going to go back to tackle again. And they've made it clear that the most important thing on draft day is getting the best value. But you do consider into that somewhat the positions you already have on the roster that you really got locked up long term. And if you got Cam Robinson, Jawaan Taylor, and Walker Little at tackle, then I'm not sure you're going to want to draft Wanya Morris unless you really, really like him at the guard spot as well. And I think that's where you could see some interest from the Jaguars, even if Jawaan Taylor comes back, because if he fits into that role, maybe you get another swing tackle on this roster. And even without that, you could look at it like, hey, Walker Little is our swing tackle, the first one, ideally the guy for the left side. And then Wanya Morris is our right tackle that backs up Jawaan Taylor. So there's some reasoning for it. And like I said, I think that this would be a pick that would make a lot of sense for the Jaguars, really around that third or fourth round projection. Wouldn't do it earlier. And if it's later, then someone really screwed up. As in someone, I mean probably 32 NFL teams. So with that said, we're going to go ahead. We're going to move on to our next prospect. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we talked about Kenny McIntosh the last time we did this video. And so for me, he's probably the top guy at running back that I would start considering, just because I don't think you're getting like a Bijan Robinson or a Jahmyr Gibbs, because they're going to go so much earlier in the draft. It's not really a spot where you want to pick up running back with ETN on the roster. However, as great as Kenny McIntosh is, I think another person that could be very worthy of a selection, specifically in the fourth round of the draft for the Jaguars, will be Roschon Johnson. So we'll start by talking about him, kind of his career, how he projects, who he really is as a player. So Roschon Johnson plays for the Longhorns. The crazy thing about him, compared to all these other guys, is that he is not a starter. He did not start for the Longhorns. However, the reasoning why is just fine, because he was backing up Bijan Robinson. And I think you could argue literally any other running back in college football would have also been a backup. So, got to consider that. Bijan kind of took the starting role from him, and so it's kind of an interesting prospect to talk about for that reason, because he was really used in more of a complementary role for that team. However, for Roschon Johnson, there's a lot of things that he's really good at, and I think there's a really good argument as well that he could be a starter in the NFL for a team. I think he could absolutely do it. So, you look at, first of all, his size, and we talk about that so much because this is a huge requirement for the Jaguars. With Trent Baalke as the GM, that's really important to this team to fit those needs. And so you've got that with Roschon Johnson, but where that also helps is with his ability to block. So that's one of the two weaknesses, I think, in the running back room right now, other than maybe injury, because that could be a weakness for about any position. But in the running back room, you've got a lack of really great pass blocking. And I think they also have a lot of room to grow with receiving from the backfield. Now, the receiving part, I quite frankly think that ETN could absolutely do that. However, ETN just has not been used in that role as much as we expected. I think they could definitely grow it, and I think they should. But whether or not he is, Roschon Johnson not only comes in as a really good pass blocker, but he also comes in as someone who can receive from the backfield. So he fits your two biggest needs at the running back position. He's likely available on day 3, so you're not spending a luxury pick. And the other important part about him is that the skill set he brings in general is very different from what ETN does. So if you're putting him in as a rusher, it's a nice change of pace for the offense. And so for all those reasons, I think it makes a ton of sense for this team to bring in Roschon Johnson on day 3 of the draft. And especially when you consider that ETN's had some injury concerns in the past, obviously going down with the Liz Frank, that was more so kind of a freak injury for that to happen in preseason on a second snap, but still, he's had injury concerns. And even this last year, he got dinged up for some games. So, getting Roschon Johnson in as your insurance policy is a really smart move for the team. And I think once we get to that day 3 period, I think that's where the team's attention is going to need a shift, is to add someone else to the running back room to try to amp up what we got there. Because as much as Jermichael Hasty was nice as a running back to complement ETN, I think you can upgrade from what he is as a number 2 And Snoop Connor, there quite frankly just wasn't a whole lot to go off of this last year. Like, it's not like he exactly made it clear that he has to be a long-term starter on this team, or just change of pace guy. Obviously, he's not going to be a starter, but I don't think he did much to prove that. And so drafting a running back, I think, will happen again. And I think that Roschon Johnson is going to be one of those obvious picks for the team towards this part of the draft. And I think there's a lot of other players that perhaps we'll talk about at some point that can make their way on this list too. So, having talked about those two guys, we're going to talk about a tight end. Going to keep it on the offensive side of the ball for one more guy. So, Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft is kind of a forgotten name right now. We talk a lot about like Michael Mayer, Darnell Washington, Luke Musgrave, even Dalton Kincaid now, getting a lot of hype. Some people even saying he should be the number one tight end. And he's actually a player I'll need to do more research into, in all honesty, so I won't comment too much on him. But Tucker Kraft, he's a very, very complete tight end as far as what he offers to a team. He's got the athleticism to get it done. He's got the physical tools. He has versatility. He's been lined up really anywhere on the formation. He's been an inline blocker. He's been in the slot. He's played outside. He's, as of now, I think if I had to describe him in just really a phrase, it'd essentially be a jack-of-all-trades player who's currently a master of none. And that master of none seems like a slight, but at the same time, he's a young player. He's not in the NFL yet. I think he has tons of room for growth, and I think that he can become a master at multiple parts of his game. And what I like about Tucker Kraft too, and this is something you'll hear me talk about a lot with these draft prospects, because I think it's important that we keep people around here and bring people in that fit the culture that Doug Peterson is trying to establish and to keep in place, rather than go back to what we've had before. And so that culture, I think it's obviously, first of all, a team culture. It's people buying into each other, but it's also some, I don't want to say necessarily all humility, but it's confidence with reserve. It's almost like meekness. Like, you don't really see this team get like overhyped on itself or buy into that. It just goes out and they want to go out and prove it every week, right? And so Tucker Kraft fits that. He's a team player. He's someone who, stuck around in South Dakota State when he was thinking about leaving, because he wanted to be around those guys because they were his family. He's not a me guy. He's someone who's going to be committed to Jacksonville if he comes here, or whatever team he gets drafted by. And he's going to want to stick around there. He is a humble player as well. And so you got to love all that. And you don't want to helmet scout too much. But Tucker Kraft also comes from a program that recently put out Dallas Goedert. So if there's questions about whether you can have a good tight end come from South Dakota State, you can. And what's even crazier about that is it's almost like Doug Peterson had that guy on his team in Philadelphia. So, all things to consider with him. And I think when I look at him, he's a really nice consolation prize, probably in the third round for this team, when you consider all the players they could draft early on, how deep this class is, and I think he's really going to be the last really good tight end on the board. And once he's gone, then I think it's going to get more so to like what we usually see at the position. Maybe there'll be some hidden gems in there, but that's kind of what I'm expecting. So with Tucker Kraft, you're adding a tight end that's pro ready. He's got room to grow. but you're not going to be cost a luxury pick like you would with Michael Mayer. Even like Luke Musgrave, Kincaid, and Washington, if they were available at 56, which I don't think all of them will be, and potentially none of them will be, that's still a pretty high draft pick. And so Tucker Kraft is in a really nice range for this team, and he fits a lot of the boxes you're looking to check off. So I think he's a smart selection for the Jaguars. I think he makes a ton of sense. I think as well he upgrades your blocking. That's an important thing to talk about for him, because that's where I would say the Jaguars are lacking the most in that department if they get Evan Ingram back. And obviously if they don't get Ingram back, then they don't got anything in that room except Luke Farrell. So you're going to need to pour a big pick into it or get a big free agent if Evan Ingram isn't here. But I expect him to be. So with that all said, we're going to move on to the defensive side of the ball for a little bit. And we're going to talk about a guy who was actually discussed as one of the best defensive players in this draft that quite frankly fell off in the last half of his college season. And so we're talking about Gervon Dexter. So Gervon Dexter, I don't think there was ever a point where he was considered equal with like Jalen Carter, but he was considered to be a potential first round pick in this draft. And because of quite frankly, just a lack of consistency, a lack of living up to the hype around himself, he's fallen off a cliff as far as where he's profiled to go in this draft. He really went from that to maybe even being available at the third selection for the Jaguars. It's possible he's on the board at that point. Now, the important thing with him, though, and why I don't think he will be available in the third round for us unless we want to trade up, is because the size, the speed, and the athleticism on Gervon Dexter is exactly what you want at that position. You have everything there. You don't have limits on his ceiling. He just makes sense from all the physical standpoints. And so I think there's going to be some team in the draft that's going to look at that and take a shot at him. Now, he is a really risky pick, in all honesty. He's not necessarily one of my favorite guys, but the reason why he makes this list is because even though he's a risky pick, if you draft Gervon Dexter and you get it right and he is who you're hoping he is, then you're able to fix your interior defensive line without giving up your first rounder. That's the nice upside with Gervon Dexter. Because if he works, it's a home run pick. It's under the ultimate boom or bust selection, really, I think, in this draft, along with obviously behind his teammate Anthony Richardson, maybe some other players. It's crazy about Florida having two of those guys, but that's kind of what you're getting with Gervon Dexter. And I think right off the bat, too, you consider like the traits he has as a player being very rare. I think you can put him in and have him start right off the bat in his career. I don't think he necessarily needs to just sit there and develop behind a player. So getting Gervon Dexter on this team, you've got a starter on the interior of the defensive line to throw out there. And he'll ultimately kind of rotate around because you've still got Devon Hamilton on this team who had a really good season, who I think is just going to keep getting better and isn't really talked about near enough. But adding Gervon Dexter to that mix, if he's what you think he is, then you're starting to feel really good about the interior of your defensive line going from where you were the last year. So that's kind of where I'm at on him. Now, would I select him? I wouldn't get him in the second round. I would only select him if he's falling to like 88 in the draft. I just wouldn't want to put in too much draft capital in that kind of risk. And that's just my opinion. I mean, I think there's arguments for why you could select him. in the second round. I think that could make sense for a team. I think you also got some other really good players on the board at that point that would make way more sense for this team. So he's still, despite all of that, an ideal prospect because of what he could offer really at his ceiling. So that's one guy on the defensive side of the ball. Now we'll talk about our next guy. He would be our, out of this entire list, the first rounder we're going to talk about. And that's Cam Smith. So I think aside from Brian Branch in this draft class, he's the most versatile of all of your top corners that are likely going first round. And you look at like Joey Porter or Devon Witherspoon, well, you may feel like they can play in the slot, more so with Devon Witherspoon because of his size. You know with Cam Smith that he can already do it because he has the experience there. And with Cam Smith, you could be getting another corner similar to Jalen Ramsey where you can just play him anywhere you want on the defense. You can play him outside. You can play him in the slot. You can move him around. Because there are some guys in the NFL who are hybrid like that, and it works really well for those defenses because it opens up the playbook. It lets you do a lot more. Now, as far as Cam Smith as a player, he's a very tough physical corner. He plays a lot bigger and stronger than his frame as well, and you'll see that with some guys. One person, for example, that is kind of clear in that category is Rashee Rice, who people thought was 6'2" before getting to the Senior Bowl because of how big he played, turned out to be 6 foot. And I know he's kind of tanking down the board right now because of that, whether he deserves to or not. But Cam Smith's kind of the same thing here, where he plays bigger than his size. And so you like that about him. You also like his competitive mentality. I don't want to say he's a huge trash talker, but I mean, he definitely gets into it with the other team. He is very competitive with them. He's not just going to sit back and not care during a game. You're not going to be worried about effort. He's going to give it his all throughout the course of an entire game. So that's stuff you're going to appreciate from him. He's a very athletic corner. And you look at all of his tools together, he's got everything he needs to be great in the slot for this team right off the bat, which is the exact place that any cornerback they select is going to start right off the get-go. You pretty much know that for a fact. So when we're looking at cornerbacks, we want to find guys who are, big hitters, the big play mentality, because you want that to fit in with your defense. And we already have that. We want to add on to it. But you also want to find guys who are good against the run game. Cam Smith can provide that. So he's one of these top corners that just makes a ton of sense for Jacksonville. Now, with how close the corner class is, there's a huge question of who's really going to be available at 24. I think one of them can be, but we just don't know which one it's going to be. We really don't, because there's even talk about how Cam Smith could go as high as number 10 to the Eagles because of the fit he has with that program. So Cam Smith has got a lot of variance as far as where he could go in the draft. So we have to consider that. He might not be a player that's available for this team at 24. But if he is, you've got a great addition on the defense. You really set up your cornerback room for success. You have another guy just like Tyson Campbell that can play the press man really well, very physical with wide receivers, and takes one of your biggest weaknesses, arguably your biggest, on the team, and turns it into a strength. So, all reasons that you gotta love Cam Smith. Now, we've got 5 guys left to talk about on here. So, our first of those, we'll swap back to the offensive side of the ball. We're going to talk about Michael Mayer. So, Baby Gronk would be his name. If you're a fan, you'll definitely know that one. Michael Mayer, right now, is pretty much the mostly unquestioned number one tight end in this class. Really has about everything you can ask for at the position. The only question with him is athleticism. It's not that's bad, but it's not necessarily like this huge strength of his. But if you watch him play football, I mean, you can fall in love with this tape. You can absolutely do that. He's an extremely complete tight end, but as a receiver, I mean, I feel bad for anyone who has to cover him because it is hard to keep him from making the catch. He is fantastic at the contested catch, and if you put that in an offense with Lawrence, then you're going to have another reliable option, especially on third downs, much like Evan Ingram was. Now, the big thing with Michael Mayer is, do you need him? Is he going to make sense for this team to select? And so there's a lot of questions surrounding that. The first one is, will Evan Ingram return to the Jaguars? And I think a couple weeks ago, you would have confidently said, well, yes, he's going to, for sure. But then there's also things that he says on social media where, I mean, I still think he's going to return, but I wonder if he's going to make it harder as far as what he's being paid, if he's going to ask for more. And I think he can, because he had a fantastic season. But at the same time for Ingram, what you have to consider is that so much of his success just comes from the fact that he played with Doug Peterson and Trevor Lawrence in the NFL. Two great people to be with. And that really changed his career. So I think the Jaguars will hold the cards there. I think they will get him back and be able to do it on their terms. But there's a chance that Ingram just decides to walk. Another team pays him a ton of money and, we see what happens. But it probably won't be as good as what he did here. So that's the first question. And the second one is, if Ingram returns, then would this pick be impactful for the team? And so that really comes down to, would Doug Peterson run a 2 tight end offense? And he would have to if he selected Mayer. I mean, that's for sure. But how efficient would that be? Would that provide the Jaguars with a huge mismatch against defenses? Would it make them really hard to cover? You got to ask a lot of questions in that, and it really comes down to, what do the Jaguars want to do? Because if that's something that they would love to get implemented in Jacksonville, by all means, Michael Mayer makes a ton of sense for this team. But those are two big questions that we have to ask ourselves, and if you can't answer both of those the right way, then I don't think Mayer is going to be your selection at 24. But hey, I mean, if Ingram's not back or this team wants to run 2 tight ends, then this is a great pick for them. It's a very logical pick. So there's questions that have got to be answered before we get to the draft to know whether Mayer will end up being an ideal pick. But I do think he makes a ton of sense still. So that's really the whole conversation with Mayer. I recommend you go watch tape on him. He's definitely one of the better players in this draft class. And with the needs on a lot of these teams, even though you could argue he might be worthy of being a top 15 prospect, I think he will be available at 24. The only 2 teams I could really see, actually probably 3 I could see going after them, I'm not sure any of them do, will be the Packers, the Lions, and probably the Chargers. And if I had to guess what happens, I think the Chargers are probably the most likely of those teams to pursue him, because I think he would just fit pretty well over there. So that's Michael Mayer. Now we got 4 guys left, and we got a heck of a lot of corners to talk about. So we're going to talk about Devon Witherspoon next. So Devon Witherspoon, out of the entire corner class, he's my personal favorite. Now, even though he's my personal favorite, doesn't mean that he's going to be available at 24 or even be an option for the team. I think he is the most complete corner in this class out of every player you have. The problem with Devon Witherspoon is that his size is not a huge strength. It's more so average or slightly below average. And so with him, I think you could see that cause him to fall on the first day. It's possible that people are getting really high on him compared to what the NFL is going to be, and that he could fall to 24, but we just don't know the answer. And if a team took him anywhere after the 5th overall pick, I don't think it would be a bad selection at all. I think it would be a great addition. I think wherever he goes, he's going to be a fantastic player. So he's my favorite guy. And a lot of the reasons why I like him, he's a big hit, big play, tone-setting mentality, and he's the exact kind of guy that Jacksonville would need in the slot right now. And he's also a player you could profile to the outside anytime you need to, or just long term. You'll say after Darius Williams retires, or if he doesn't pan out for the next couple of years. I do think he will, but it's good to have that versatility. Especially because we have to consider if the Jaguars have a single injury on the outside and we get a guy who can only play in the slot, then we're screwed at cornerback. We're going to need to make a trade for someone if we can even make a trade at that point, or you got to find someone who can fill that hole. And I'm not sure you're going to have a single person available on the free agent market in the middle of the season to the end of the season. So getting a guy with versatility has to be a requirement for the Jaguars, and Devon Witherspoon offers that. Now, as far as some of his strengths, just going back to that, he's another man coverage guy. That's where he excels, and that's the kind of scheme that we're going to be looking for once again from Mike Caldwell this next year. Those are the kind of players he wants, and we saw him try to force that through this last year until he finally started to play to the strengths of his players. But that's what he wanted from corners. Like Darius Williams, he's ultimately a zone guy, and they had to adjust for that. But getting in a player like Devon Witherspoon brings in someone who fits what Mike Caldwell wants to do and would have really any of his weaknesses completely eliminated from his game just playing in the slot. So he's definitely a pick that would make a ton of sense, but the question is, can he fall to 24? And I think that's unlikely. But at the same time, we also talked on a video a couple weeks ago about how he could be a player you trade up for. I think if he's available around 18 or 19, and you think that him as a player is that much of an improvement over, say, another selection like an Osiris Torrance or like a Cam Smith, then go trade a third rounder and move up to that point. I think that's an option. But you're probably going to have to move up if you want to acquire him. So that's where I'm at on him. He's my favorite corner in this class overall, my number one guy. Now, we'll move back to the offense for a moment, and then we've got two more corners to talk about to wrap this up. So, Xavier Hutchinson, wide receiver out of Iowa State. To me, out of every receiver in this class, when you consider where they're likely to be selected and what they offer and their background, Xavier Hutchinson is the obvious pick for me for the Jaguars. He is the clear obvious one. You look at his game style, for one. He's the perfect Marvin Jones replacement. He's a contested catch guy. He's going to be someone that you can value in the red zone, who can turn those field goals into touchdowns, can convert you into scores. He's got the versatility to be a big slot receiver. There's going to be no size concerns really with Xavier Hutchinson. I mean, you're going to like all that about him. Really, the only concerns, and I guess they're not necessarily concerns, they're more so that he's not going to be like super strong in these areas. he's not going to burn the top of a defense. He's not going to be like this amazing speed threat. But he's going to be a solid receiver for a team, and he's going to be your contested catch guy on the offense. And so you love all that about Xavier Hutchinson, but what sells it even more to me is just him as a person, and also considering he's from Jacksonville. This is one of those stories where if this took place, if the Jaguars were able to select him, it's one of the best stories from the draft. It's a home run hit for this team if they're getting Xavier Hutchinson in, say, the third round of the NFL draft. Might need to be the second, but I think it's a home run at that point. You look at him, and the first thing you're going to see is someone who can play in a rotational role, someone who can come in and really fill in for any position if you have an injury at receiver, someone who's going to be able to make the big plays when you need it, someone that Lawrence will probably become reliable upon. And long term, I think he could be a replacement for Zay Jones if, say, Zay Jones doesn't have a great year next season. And even if it's not next season, I think long term, he should be a starter in the NFL. He should be a player that sticks around here for a long time. I don't think he's a wasted pick. So I think the problem with acquiring him and why we probably won't see it happen is because he's probably going to fall in that range where it's between your picks. Like, I'm not sure I would want to spend 56 on him. I wouldn't be mad if they did, but I think there's also other things you could do that would do a lot more for this roster that would have a higher ceiling as a move. And so 88 is where I want him, but I don't know if he's going to fall to 88. Because we saw this last year, how crazy teams went over receivers. They wanted to make sure they had their guy. After Devonte Adams, Tyrique Hill, all these guys got traded and set these records for contracts. And you saw guys just fly off the board to the point where I think it was 65. The best receiver, I think, at that point was like Jalen Tolbert. And Xavier Hutchinson's better than Jalen Tolbert. So I'm not sure he's going to be available. Now, if that happens again, the Jaguars will need to take advantage of that, and they'll need to look at these other positions and get steals there. That's what they'll need to do in response. But I'm not sure that Xavier Hutchinson's going to be available at the right pick. I just think if he is, he's an obvious selection for the team. Obvious receiver to draft. So we're going to wrap this up with two different corners, both in press man. That's really where they find their strong suits. But we're going to start with Deonte Banks. So with Deonte Banks, the first thing you have with him is outstanding size. I believe he's 6'2". He has great ball skills, and he's got a ton of physicality to his game, which is why he can play press man. He can make contact with receivers off the line. He's going to disrupt routes, and he's going to be a huge strength for this team in all of that. He also profiles really well into the slot, so you're going to be able to start him there right off the bat in his career, and you could look at him being an outside starter if needed at any point. So he fits your requirement for versatility at the position. Now, compared to our other guy, who we'll talk about in a minute, where the weakness really comes for Deonte Banks and why I would rank him a little lower right now, is that Deonte Banks struggles with play recognition, which is where this other player is very successful. And so that's something that Banks is going to have to improve, because he's going to just struggle to really respond to what's going on the field. And you're going to need that to be better if you're going to want him to succeed in that role. If you want him to be impactful against the run, he's going to have to know there's a run play going on. So his processing skills are going to need to improve. But if they do, if he comes up to speed, which I absolutely think he can, then you're getting a really nice cornerback, probably with your second pick of the draft. That's going to have a huge impact for this team and going to profile as a long-term starter that you keep around past that rookie deal. So he's a logical selection for this team. Definitely someone that fits the bill. However, the guy I want to talk about last, and one of my favorites in this draft process, is Tyrique Stevenson. And there's not many things that I don't like about Tyrique Stevenson. Right off the bat, like I said earlier, the mentality of a player is important. Who they are as a person is going to be important to the team. Because if we have divas come in, it's going to change the culture of this team, and it could tear apart what's been built. That's why, for example, I'm not sitting here begging for Jalen Ramsey to come back. Don't think there's anything wrong with wanting great players like that. But I also understand that Jalen Ramsey would carry a high risk of bringing that me personality back. And I don't think that's good for this team. Tyrique Stevenson, you're not going to have to worry about that. He's a team player. He's a guy who values just the chance to be in the NFL. I watched his Senior Bowl interview, and that's really what sold me on him as a person and his fit with Jacksonville, because he was just humbled to be able to get to play on the same field as these guys. And that has nothing to do with he's not competitive. He doesn't have the mentality to go toe-to-toe with anyone in the NFL. Nothing to do with that. He's a guy who's going to value every single snap he takes in a game because that's where he wants to be, and he's thankful for that. That's the way I look at him as a person. So, as a culture fit, it's a home run. It's everything you could ask for. So, in that same Senior Bowl as well, he was one of the standouts there, one of the best players. He's incredible at the contested catch. Can really go up against any receiver. And like Deonte Banks, he's another guy who's successful in press coverage, in man-to-man coverage. Tyrique Stevenson has an insane level of physicality to his game. And you compare him to other cornerbacks, he is a stronger guy. And I mean, you could probably just even tell off of pictures of him, he's got a lot of muscle to him. I mean, he can really go toe-to-toe with anyone off the line. So you're going to have that in the slot. You've got a player who also is very aggressive in the way he plays, much like some of the guys in Jacksonville, like an Andre Sisco, for example. And that can kind of bite you if he doesn't make the right decision. Where Tyrique Stevenson is just a really good prospect is in his play recognition ability. He knows what's going on every play. He can guess what wide receivers are going to do, and the vast majority of the time he's right. So instead of seeing him have these terrible plays go against him, most of the time he's guessing right and he's blowing up plays. So you love that about him. I mean, you gotta love that about him. And for that reason, and some of the errors we mentioned, he could be a third shutdown corner for this defense. You could have three guys playing the position that you feel like can shut down opposing receivers. And then if you add that to this team, really the big question for the secondary then is, will the linebacking core improve outside of Foye Oluokun? Because if that does, I think you go from having a questionable back half of the team to having one of the best ones in the NFL. One that's really only going to be beaten by the best players. So that's more stuff you're going to love about Stevenson. His size, he's a little shorter than what Deonte Banks is, but like we said, he's got more muscle on him. He's a stronger player, and that's going to lead to more success in press coverage. He's going to be able to knock receivers off their routes, disrupt plays. He's also really good against the run because he's got the ability to really take down anyone. He's not going to be a guy who's just going to bulldoze over him unless it's, maybe Derrick Henry, and he does that to most people in the NFL, except for Shaquille Quarterman, apparently. But another thing with Stevenson as well that doesn't get talked about a lot, he's also a home run player if he gets the the ball in his hands. He's not just going to be a guy who gets interceptions, but I think you could see him return them for pick sixes. He could completely flip the game. And so if you're adding him to your team, you're getting a guy who takes a spot that flipped the game for the other team in their favor, where they took advantage of Trey Herndon in the slot. Not that Trey Herndon was horrible, but he's a backup for a reason. He's a very good backup, but you leave him in that role, you hope he doesn't see the field. You take that's an advantage for the other team, and you turn it into your advantage in the same way it was for them. And so those are all reasons I want to have Stevenson on this team. I think he would be, probably out of everyone on the board at that point, the best selection this team would have in the second round. I think he would be the best one. You consider the value in the draft capital cost for him. I think out of all the cornerbacks in this class, when you're considering all of that, you can make a really good argument that Stevenson is the best value. And so he's the last guy we'll talk about on here. Definitely someone I'd love to see in Jacksonville. Only have to move a few hours up the coast. He's out in Miami, played for the Hurricanes. So, hey, he's used to Florida, right? But I recommend for you guys, take the time to learn about these players. Take the time to learn about some of these other guys. Draft process is really fun. I enjoy talking about it. It's one of my favorite times of the year. If you've got anyone that you want to recommend to us to talk about, any prospects you want to bring to light, any ideas you want to see implemented on this channel, let me know. Definitely open to it. I appreciate you all watching. We'll have more content out this week. Planning to upload really every day that we can. Probably won't on Sundays, but that's about it. So thank you all for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and go Jags.